It's your Bandito Lowski. Today we're going to talk about drilling. So I've seen a lot of people talk about the ecological approach and how it can help people in terms of their classes and different things. I haven't necessarily seen a whole lot of people talk about traditional drilling, and I also think it's really interesting that a lot of people have their different interpretations of what drilling looks like. So as someone who's somewhat of an expert who's taught this for many years, I just figured I would give my 2 cents on traditional drilling and just kind of some of the different ways you can go about it, my perspective on it. So, first and foremost, to me, the foundation of drilling and teaching through drilling is intention. I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make as a coach when you're having your students drill is to not have a clear vision for what you want their experience to be, right? And what I mean by that is, when you're thinking about, I'm going to show them an omoplata, right? I'm going to show them a kimura, right? There's so much that goes into just what we're showing, right? First and foremost, why are we showing the kimura? What context does that kimura exist in? Where are we starting from, right? How much of the kimura are we drilling each point in time, right? There's so much that goes into just that, right? We can go for days and days and days and days and days. We have to focus somewhere, right? And I think it's also really important as a coach to have a strong reason why you're having your students drill one thing over another, right? And just having an organized curriculum. It's like today we're going to be drilling closed guard. We're going to be drilling closed guard all week, and just having a strong sense of why we're drilling closed guard. What makes that important? What makes that something that we should do this week as opposed to next week, right? And what things we're going to learn that week. In terms of some of the variables that make traditional drilling work better whenever you're having it, whenever you're applying it with your students, right? The first is going to be very simple, but I think it gets overlooked a lot is the time spent during each drill, right? And what I mean by that is after you show your technique, right, whatever that is, and your students break and pair off with each other, one of the first things that I think is really important as a coach to have a strong sense of is how long are they going to be doing that? Is it 5 minutes? Is it 6 minutes? Is it 7 minutes? Is it 8 minutes? Is it 3 minutes? And why, right? Is it because of the way that you're trying to pace the class? Is it because of how much that you decided to show them and how much you're going to have them drill, right? If we're having a shorter drill, like if I'm not necessarily showing that much technique, I'm probably not going to have them drill for 8 minutes. If I'm showing them a really long sequence, I think it's best to give them a good amount of time in order to process that sequence, right? In addition to that, the cadence is really important, right? Are we going 1-1, 2-1, 2-3, 3-3? What is it? I think it's really weird that so many coaches have their students break and then all of the students have to decide amongst themselves what that's going to look like. I think that's a very simple thing that the coach can decide for the class that, hey, we're going to drill this 2-2. Hey, we're going to drill this 1-1. We're going to do 3-3. And why you would do that, right? You could have a shorter drill. Like, for example, if we're really doing just a 2-on-1 pull into close guard, realistically, that's so short that you're better off doing something like 3-3, so that way that one student is getting enough reps to warrant that transition, and you're not in a situation where you spend more time changing positions than you do actually doing the drill. The next part is intensity, right? That's another thing that the students, oddly enough, tend to just decide for themselves. Like, how intense are we drilling? Are we drilling this really slowly? Are we drilling this really quickly, right? Am I going to give you a ton of resistance? Am I not going to give you any resistance? Am I just going to be a noodle, right? A lot of times when that's left up to the students, we have such a varying degree in terms of what a student's experience is. And I feel like as a coach, you can take ownership and be like, hey guys, we're going to drill this, at a slow pace or a low heart rate. Hey guys, we're going to drill this at a higher heart rate. Give your opponent some resistance. Make sure that, you're doing X, Y, Z, right? And the last variable that I think is really impactful is focus. How much attention are we paying to this drill, right? How invested are we in like how our bodies are moving and the technique, right? I think that's really important because sometimes you have a situation in which You want your students to be paying very close attention to all of the finer details in terms of the way that they're in the close guard, how they're squeezing, where their feet are positioned, how their knees are positioned, where the knees are on the hips, all the different nitty-gritty details. And I think it's really, really important to make it very clear to the students that this is what you're expecting of them, as opposed to leaving that up to the students and having one person who really, really wants to focus and get super nerdy about all the details of half guard, and one person who really just doesn't give a shit and is going through the motions, right? So those are the four details that are variables, rather, that I think are very simple, very easy to adjust. But I think those details, whenever you have a clear vision for and a clear intention for, they make your traditional drilling class a lot more impactful. Now, I also wanted to go into different types of drilling, right? Because within the subsection, I feel like there's different, you know, variations of what drilling can be, right? So the first and foremost, this is one that everybody recognizes and that we see from like the IBJJF podium factories, which is the speed drill, right? You've seen people do the leg drag drill or some sort of passing drill, right? Where they're going for speed, they're going for reps, they're trying to get as many reps in a certain amount of time as possible, right? One of the things about that type of drill is that your focus isn't necessarily super deliberate, right? Obviously, you're getting the technique right, or for the most part correct, but the focus is speed, right? The focus is making sure that I'm doing this as accurately as I can to do this quickly, right? And then, of course, the intensity is really high because it's a speed drill, right? The cadence for this, typically in a speed drill, is a one-person dominant cadence. So it's like a lot of times in a speed drill, it's like, oh no, only one person is going for this section of time. And it's like, oh yeah, this person's going, they're only doing the speed drill for, let's say, a minute, and then we're going to switch off, and then the other person does it for a minute. And then that leads me back to the time spent. When we're doing a speed drill, typically the time spent doing that type of drill is shorter because it's at a higher intensity. It's really hard to keep that up for like 8 minutes. That's not something that's realistic. But again, we took into account all those four variables, right? Now let's talk about slow and deliberate, or slow or deliberate drilling, right? So this is the type of drilling where I show you some new shit, right? I just got I just bootlegged the DVD from the Hungarian Sambo dude you never heard of, and I have an entirely new leg lock system that I'm about to bring to my advanced class, right? And everything looks different, everything's got different names. You ain't even seen this type of knee bar before. It makes his knee go like, right? So if I'm showing you that type shit, or if I just have my white belts and I'm introducing them to like the next level of advanced technique, or the next progression of technique that's a little bit more advanced, we're going to start with slower, deliberate drilling, right? Where the cadence is going to be maybe 2-2, just enough to make sure that you get a couple solid looks. You can take a look at that one more time, and then you switch off. You get a feel for what your partner's doing. Your partner's doing this at a lower intensity, lower heart rate. This type of drilling has a higher level of focus, and this type of drilling typically has a longer amount of time spent, right? A lot of times when I do this type of drilling, it's usually 6 to 8 minutes is probably the sweet spot. And a lot of times it's because we have a good amount of shit. There's a good amount of shit that we're working in there. There's some transitions in that bitch. So it's like, okay, cool. There's a good amount to chew on, to process, in order to keep people like engaged and stimulated, which I think is really important. And when you mix these up, right, you run a better chance of keeping your students very much stimulated and engaged throughout the whole class, right? The next portion is going to be, or the next variation is going to be repetition drills. And it's kind of like what it sounds like. It's this idea of like, I want you to drill like a mindless zombie. I don't want you to think about what you're doing. I just want you to go through the motions. And you're like, Carlos, that sounds terrible. Why would you ever want to do that? Well, you might want to do that with something that you are, maybe you got a technique, right? That you see your students, they learned it, right? They know how to do it, and maybe they just got to the point where they can do it live. They just got to the point where they can do it live on a white belt or blue belt, right? Just you showed it to them a couple days ago and they're already starting to get it. They're like, oh yeah, I got this. This is nice. This is clean. I'm gonna start to do it, right? Maybe it's not perfect, but they're able to do it some of the times. This would be an instance in which I would use a repetition drill, right? Because my goal in that situation is I don't want you, like, I don't need you to focus on the specifics of the technique anymore because I know you can already do it. At the same time, I don't want you to lose any of the work or any of the neural pathways that you've already built, right, through variation or through failure in certain situations. I want to make sure that, I am hammering in and reinforcing what you've already got and what you feel confident in. And typically with this type of repetition drill, we have some dope ass music. You can talk with your drilling buddy. The goal is to just get as many reps as you can. We do this at a medium intensity. Cadence is probably 2-2, maybe 3-3 if the drill is a little bit shorter. Time spent on this is also going to be about like 6 to 8 minutes. And then the focus is, there is no focus. I just want you to go through the motions as much as possible and get as many of those reps as you can, right, at a lower pace or slower pace so that we can reinforce those subconscious neural pathways, right? And we can reinforce that subconscious muscle memory. So that way, when you're in a position in which I, as a coach, see you in mid-roll and I see that opportunity for you to do that thing, I can call it out and you have a much easier time, right, going through that sequence on that training partner, rather than I call it out and you have to think. You're like, what was that? Where did I do that? You don't have to make any of those sounds. You could just call it out and be like, I could just be like, Ultra Kimura, and then you know exactly what you're doing. Whoop, 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 boom, 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 right? And whether you're successful or not really doesn't matter, right? It just means that, like, I can call that out and you know exactly what I'm looking for, and you can execute that after I call it out under stress, right? So one of my favorite types of drilling is experimental drilling. And I learned this concept from listening to Gary Tonin and hearing him talk about the concept of breaking a technique, taking a technique as far as you possibly could before it fell apart, right? Before you no longer have it and it no longer serves the function that you're trying to do. So this is essentially what we're trying to express within the drill. We give our students a submission, a position, a sequence, and we essentially give them the free reign to break all of the rules that we just laid out for them. All of the structure that we just built, they get to deconstruct and figure out how do they achieve the same end goal, right? And how far can they take things in all directions, right? We want them to break the technique. We want them to essentially make the position fall apart. And this takes time and practice to know how to do effectively and how to do constructively. It might seem like a waste of time at first, but it's important to go through that phase, though. It's important to go through the phase where you're kind of doing something and tinkering with something, and you don't really have anything, to get to a point where you feel like, okay, I've gotten good at taking this past the point of where the technique no longer works, and I've gotten good at moving just a little bit backwards, right? Moving a little bit backwards and trying to find that sweet spot where this shit still works. The sweet spot where I can salvage this failed armbar and move backwards and I still have it. Where I can move backwards and I can reconnect that knee line just barely and finish the toe hold, right? It all depends on the level of skill that we're able to develop in terms of our ability to experiment, right? So that to me is really valuable. I think there's a lot of value in giving your students the space to do that. And the beauty of the experimental drill is the fact that normally if we're doing this like in straight lead game, or if we're doing this in a live roll where there's a lot more resistance and you have that arm bar that you're trying to salvage and you lose it, that shit's gone. There's no redo. There's no you don't get an opportunity. That shit's gone and forever, and that's it. And you might only get one rep of that. this would be an environment in which you get multiple reps of that specific area if you want. And that to me, I think is really, really cool and really, really valuable. And I feel like it helps promote creativity. It gives your students freedom. And I feel like having this level of variation among with the other types of drills really helps the students remain engaged throughout the whole class. Some of the other things I wanted to talk about with drilling that I think is really interesting, I don't often see talked about, are things like progression, things like your starting point, right? You can play around a lot with those things. So if we're talking about a closed guard armbar drill, right? We can start our students in closed guard, but you could also start in butterfly guard. You could also start standing. You could think about, how do you get to that position that I'm going to attack my submission from, and add that and include that as part of the drill. Some of my best drilling experiences come from drilling in a progression, where when I came up, we would drill the setup to the position that we were trying to get to, and that would be part of the sequence, right? We would just drill the setup to get to the position, and that would be the first part of what we were drilling. And then afterwards, once we're in that position, right, we would move on and we would have the next section, right? We're in closed guard. All right, how do we get to a point where our opponent's posture is broken? All right, like how are we breaking the posture? And in terms of the way that you get to close guard, in terms of the way that you break the posture, something that can be very valuable is thinking about creating dilemmas, right? Creating dilemmas for your students is really good, or just your drilling partners, your drilling session, making sure that you have dilemmas. To me, that's a very smart way to go about that process. I also think it's really good to think about making sure that your setups are as high level, in fact even more high level than your typical attacks, right? Because you could have some very basic shit that you're trying to execute, and if you have some slick ass fucking setups, right, if you have a slick ass K guard to close guard entry, if you have a slick ass fake flower sweep to posture break setup, mm, mm, we're cooking with grease now. This is some slick shit. This might work on somebody who's technically on paper better than you, right? Which is something you always want your students to be able to execute, and something you always want to be able to execute yourself, especially if we're doing traditional drilling as our modality for skill acquisition, right? That part of the beauty of drilling is you can plug in, you can add in, you can download anything you set your mind to. You can download that shit. Anything you see, you can download that shit. So we always want to make sure that like that is something that we're capable of and we're kind of striving for. So don't sleep on your setups. Your setups are opportunities to make even the most simplest basic ass drill very interesting, very engaging, and still very effective, right? And then just like I was saying, we drill the setup to the position, we drill the setup, right, the close guard to the posture break, right? And then we move so on and so forth. Typically, my experience, we would take a sequence and it would be broken down into 4 chunks, right? And each chunk would stack onto the next chunk. In between those chunks, a tool that you can use, this is something that I got from my old coach Marvin Castell, is something called a 1 minute burst. What he would have us do is we would have a 1 minute burst where one person is getting all of the reps, right? You can drill that slow, you can drill that fast, that could be medium. That was all you. That was whatever you decided you wanted that time to be for yourself, right? If you had maybe a shitty drilling partner, if you know if the reps weren't right, if you didn't love the rhythm that you guys were going at, this was your time to get the most out of your training, those 1 minute bursts. And so many people, including myself, got so much out of those 1 minute bursts, and that 1 minute burst would just reinforce whatever we were drilling before. It would make sure that you got that shit, right? That repetitive drilling within that slow, deliberate drilling class format, right? So then we would have that close guard entry drill, and then we would have the 1 minute burst of the close guard entry drill. And then right afterwards, we would have close guard entry drill to the posture break. And then afterwards, 1 minute burst of the close guard entry into the posture break. And by the time you got to the point where we're finishing the arm bar, you've done so many reps of all the other stuff that shit is like muscle memory, and it feels very slick and it feels very smooth. My goal when I drill typically either privately with buddies or friends of mine, or if I'm drilling in a class setting, or if I'm running a class, right? My drill for the students, whoever's doing the drill, right? The goal, at least from my perspective, should be the ability to execute this live on someone that is not as good as you are. You should be able to do this on a white belt live after the class. If their students can do that, if they can do this on someone who's not as good as them live, we've made the most out of that time, right? That to me is the ultimate goal. And then we have somewhere to work from, right? But if you can't do it live at that point, then to me, we're not utilizing any of the potential tools within our arsenal when it comes to the different variations of drilling, when it comes to, understanding the variables that we can play around with in order to maximize engagement. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about this type of video. Like, comment, subscribe. Peace.